So I decided to start this off with the standards and objectives because I think it's very important that with whatever lesson that you're doing based off the student's needs, you're going to always have to start by going off the correct standard and objective. Whenever you go off the correct standards and objectives, you're always going to have to choose the right materials and activities to use based off of that. So for an example, if a student is struggling with decoding, the teacher is going to have to choose a book with specific diagrams or specific things that relate to decoding in that book that will help that student. But in turn, this teacher is going to have to start off by using the correct standards and objectives so that they know how to plan accordingly based off the student's needs. So then we move on to the balanced literacy. So balanced literacy is so important because it incorporates reading and writing and how they correspond to one another. As a student learns how to read, they learn how to write, and as they learn how to write, they learn how to read. And this is important when students learn because this is also tied into the standards and objectives. Whenever students are learning this, the teachers are teaching them this based off those standards. So then we move on to the big five of reading. And this consists of vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, phonics, and phonemic awareness and sub-skills. And phonics is very important in early young readers because they're basically developing that foundational knowledge of letter sound correspondence. So you're teaching a student, well, the letter K makes the K sound. So that whenever they're reading a book, they're able to decode it and sound it out as independently as they possibly can. And it also helps with blends as well. Whenever you're teaching a student, well, even though we see the letter K, whenever we're reading it, we might also see a C attached to that K, but it still makes the same sound. So when we go on to the big five of reading, we also think about comprehension as a really huge part of this. So with explicit comprehension more specifically, this is whenever a student is basically to recall specific facts from the text without looking beyond the text. So for an example of this would be, a teacher will have the student read the book about the three little pigs. After the student finishes reading, the teacher will ask the student, what did the first pig make their house out of? If the student displays explicit comprehension, the student will be able to respond that this pig made their first house out of straw. So that would display that the student has a good foundational knowledge of explicit comprehension because they're not having to recall anything beyond the text. So when we move on to balanced literacy, interactive read-alouds is an important part of that because interactive read-alouds gives the students the opportunity to read themselves and be a part of the text. And in turn of that, the teacher is always going to have to base what book they use and what strategies they use for the interactive read-alouds off the standards and objectives. So whenever we move on to interactive read-alouds, we have shared reading, guided reading, and a running record. Whenever we do shared reading, this basically takes place in the center of the classroom where all the students gather around the carpet or wherever they do the shared reading, and students will typically, with the teacher's help, because they're going to be reading a book that they can't independently read on their own. But they'll basically take turns in reading different parts of the book, and once they're done finishing the book, the teacher will grab a learning moment from the text that they read and make a lesson based off of comprehension possibly, whether it be implicit or explicit, or even character development or even plot development. And this could be based off of like a sci-fi book or a nonfiction book or a fiction book as well.